Hello, welcome to Western Resource Advocates webinar, Advanced Clean Cars 2, a key step toward clean air and climate action across the West. I'm Jenna Nava, Communications Manager at WRA and the Zoom webinar host for our event today. Just a few quick reminders before we jump in. The webinar today will be 1 hour, and while the format is mostly Q&A between our moderator and panelists, we will be taking questions from our audience via Zoom's Q&A function, which will show up as the Q&A icon in the bottom center of your screen. And while we might not be able to answer all questions, we will try to follow up as needed if we can't get to your specific questions today. We've also enabled closed captioning. That feature should show up also as an icon at the bottom of your screen as well. And so you should be able to turn that on and off throughout the webinar as you see fit. And finally, the webinar is being live streamed to WRA's Facebook and LinkedIn pages and recorded. We will send everyone who's registered, whether in attendance today or not, the recording within the next few days. Before I turn it over to our moderator, I first want to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors for today's event. First up is our premier sponsor, Vision Ridge Partners, which aims to deliver superior financial returns and positive environmental impact through investments in sustainable real assets. Our signature sponsors include Torch Clean Energy, BOS Developments, and Conservation Colorado. As a nonprofit, our work depends on donations and partnerships with businesses, organizations, and individuals throughout our region and beyond. Our generous sponsors and supporters allow WRA to bring you important programming and resources like today's webinar to share innovative solutions to our region's most pressing conservation challenges. I encourage you to visit westernresourceadvocates.org/donate to learn how you can help support on-the-ground solutions to climate change. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to our moderator, Deborah Kapoloff. As WRA's Transportation Electrification Policy Analyst, Deb advocates for policies which reduce emissions in the transportation sector, focusing on transportation electrification and the adoption of electric vehicles in all of WRA's states. Deb's policy work seeks to maximize the environmental and economic benefits of transportation electrification for communities across the West. Deb?
Thanks, Jen. Before we get started with our wonderful panelists, I just wanted to take a quick moment to give a little bit more background and context on what Advanced Clean Cars 2 is. So Advanced Clean Cars 2 is a policy that states can adopt because under the Clean Air Act, California has the ability to develop its own more stringent rules for governing transportation emissions. And then states can then independently choose to either stick with the federal emission standard or to adopt those rules under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act. So if you hear myself or any of our panelists referring to Section 177 states during this webinar, that is just referring to states that have chosen to exercise that authority and to adopt standards promulgated by California. So Advanced Clean Cars 2, which we'll be discussing today, is the follow-up policy to Advanced Clean Cars 1, which instituted a minimum EV sales requirement for auto manufacturers and is currently in place in California as well as in other Section 177 states. So this policy really picks up where ACC 1 left off, and it continues to increase the percentage of EV sales that manufacturers have to meet and eventually culminates in a 100% EV sale requirement in 2035. But this policy is not only just about an EV sales minimum percentage requirement, it's also about the type of EVs that are sold. And so ACC 2 includes technology standards, which auto manufacturers have to meet. And these standards improve the quality of EVs that are being sold in several ways. Some of these mechanisms to improve the quality of EVs sold under Advanced Clean Cars 2 include requiring the provision of charging ports when vehicles are sold to make that a more seamless transition in terms of charging infrastructure, making it easier to get service on an EV. And then additionally, and this is a really big benefit of this policy, is improving the range of EVs in terms of the minimum mileage range that EVs have to meet in order to be eligible to be counted for credit under the rural mechanism, as well as increasing the durability of batteries in these vehicles. So ensuring that when consumers purchase these vehicles, they know that they can rely on these vehicles for years to come. And so with that little bit of background out of the way, I would like to introduce our panelists. So first, welcome to Juan Roberto Madrid. Juan is the Colorado Clean Transportation and Energy Policy Advocate for Green Latinos. He is a public health professional with 33 years of healthcare experience, 22 of which were through military service. After Juan's retirement, he went on to work for some of Colorado's largest healthcare provider systems. Juan then combined his passion for the outdoors with his healthcare experience and got involved in research on how climate change is impacting the Colorado River Basin. He currently serves on the Colorado Public Health Association board. Next, we are happy to welcome Anna Wong today. Anna is a supervisor within the Advanced Clean Cars program at the California Air Resources Board. She has been the lead of the California Zero Emission Vehicle regulation for more than 15 years and was instrumental in California becoming the first jurisdiction in the world with a 100% zero emission vehicle mandate. Next, welcome to Chris Harto. Chris is an engineer and sustainability professional with 20 years of experience performing policy relevant research for governments, national laboratories, universities, industry, and organizations. He leads Consumer Reports' research on clean vehicles, fuel economy, energy efficiency, and other energy and sustainability topics. The primary focus of his research in recent years has been on the consumer benefits of electric vehicles. And our last panelist, thanks to Erin Kressick for joining us today. Erin is the Transportation Electrification Manager at Western Resource Advocates. Erin leads WRA's work across the region to develop and implement policies which will accelerate the widespread adoption of electric vehicles and other technologies with the potential to significantly reduce emissions from the transportation sector. His work focuses on securing policies and plans which will maximize the environmental and economic benefits that electrified transportation can offer to the interior West. So welcome to all of our panelists. So glad to have you here with us today. And we will get started with a question for all panelists. So can you please share what you see as the larger market forces and policy developments that are accelerating widespread use of electric vehicles to really contextualize Advanced Clean Cars II as a policy? And let's start with Chris Harto.
Thanks. Yes, so we're really starting to see a virtuous cycle take hold between growing consumer demand, increased automaker investments, and strengthening policy support. Our surveys at Consumer Reports have consistently shown that interest in buying an EV skyrockets for consumers who have firsthand experience with them. As more EVs are sold, more consumers have family, friends, and neighbors who own EVs, which increases the chances they will want one too. The policy supports, like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, the Infrastructure Reduction Act, and Advanced Clean Cars II, are helping give automakers the confidence that they need to increase their investments to deliver more EVs to consumers faster, which will help continue this growth cycle.
Great, thank you, Chris. Juan, would you like to add on to that?
Yes, I think for our primarily marginalized communities and those communities living in disproportionately impacted communities, we're seeing the interest in EVs increase and rise as greater education is provided about the EVs and about that conversion. We know that in these communities, they're most impacted by that air quality. And with the recent spikes in gasoline, as more of our community members get into EVs through the use of some of these incentive programs, now we're seeing neighbors going up to the Latino on the block saying, hey, first we were teasing you about the EV, now we're asking how much you're saving, how much the costs are, and we're seeing that energy, if you will, around EVs increasing in our DIC communities. And so we think these Clean Cars 2 and the programs that will come with that will help incentivize and get even more of our community invested in converting over to EVs.
That's really exciting to hear, Juan. Anna, let's go to you, and then Aaron.
I really don't have much to add to what my colleagues just presented. I would say that the emphasis on it's not just California pushing zero emission vehicles with its own policy, but that we have a lot of states that have joined on to Advanced Clean Cars 1 that helped really send the signal that not just Californians were interested in electric vehicles, and then just really the international policy that's taken hold in very large markets has sent the signal to the manufacturers, and the manufacturers themselves are now completely switching gears. So those things have are totally invaluable in my mind, and it's really it's nice to not be the only state with the strangest people liking electric vehicles. But I think Chris and Juan said it right.
Yeah, I think great points from everyone on this. I think one thing, there's lots of components you could talk about this regarding this, but I think one thing I would say that's just interesting and exciting is that, in the policy space where previously, it had been states that had been singularly driving policy towards electrified transportation, we're now in a space where there's lots of intersections between the federal government pushing for things as well as the state governments. And it's creating all sorts of new opportunities to advance electric vehicles in ways that we hadn't seen before. And I think, and now and in the coming years, we're really going to see the fruition of those two, the state government and federal government coming together, and really excited for what's to come as a product of that.
Thanks all. And although I did have that very brief slide trying to explain Advanced Clean Cars 2, it's great to have you on, Anna Wong, since you are so instrumental in creating this rule. So can you talk a little bit about what the new Advanced Clean Cars 2 standard does and what it is? And then can you also talk a little bit about some of the myths and misconceptions about the policy?
Yeah, we could spend a whole webinar just on the myths and misconceptions about the policy. So Advanced Clean Cars incorporates 3 different types of rules. One is for actually gasoline vehicles, since they'll be on the road and being sold through 2034. So there's rules that encompass new testing requirements, and the way that manufacturers do their fleet averaging is different now, and now ZEVs cannot be factored in, and that is meaningful because then that means gasoline vehicles will actually continue to get cleaner. So some of especially the criteria pollutant benefits come from that part of the rule. Then we have the zero emission vehicle regulation, which sets a zero emission standard to 100% by 2035, which includes plug-in hybrids. That would be, I'm just going to put that out there. That's a misconception that plug-in hybrids are a part of that. And that means that's a vehicle with both a gasoline engine and a very large battery that can be recharged and drive only on electricity. And then, so that's the I would say the most flashy part of the rule that got the most headlines. And it starts at 35% in 2026 model year. And when we say model year, that's just like the year in which vehicles are made, and they're made over a 2-year period. But it's like right now, on September 30th of 2022, we're in the 2023 model year, just as a little fact check, if we ever say these words like model year that nobody else says like in the world, but we say them as regulators. The third thing is ZEV assurance measures, which were included in your summary. And when we say ZEV assurance measures, that's a way of saying what will it take to get that consumer out of their gasoline vehicle and meet their needs as they see them over the life of that vehicle. And not only when that vehicle is new, but also when it is used. And so I think that you said, you've already kind of pointed out some of the aspects of it, but this includes, minimum range requirements. That also includes not only when it's new, so we call those durability requirements, that over 10 years or 150,000 miles at that, 70 to 80% of that range has to be maintained. And then we go with new warranty requirements, which matches the best in the industry today, for battery warranties and for powertrain warranties. There is new charging standards. Right now, there's 3 different DC fast charging inlets. We've chosen one that will probably send a signal to the industry for sure. Europe has done this, so we're a little bit behind them, but we've seen now, as we're all trying to ramp up all of our infrastructure, which I'm sure we're going to talk about as states that are implementing these rules, the vehicles now have to be just meeting one inlet standard. So that's a really big part of the rule. The convenience cord that has to be included, that's both capable of level 1, which is like a 110 outlet, normal outlet at your house, or level 2, which is more like a dryer outlet. It's a little bit faster charging. Every convenience cord will be dual capable. That's a big deal. And then service information, which we also talked about. So that just means that any service information that manufacturers give to their dealers, they also have to give it to independent repair shops, which makes sure that those folks are part of this transition and that they're able to service and repair these vehicles. One other thing is battery labeling, which slightly helps with our recycling issues that will come later. More than likely with these vehicles, and it's just a simple label that gives enough information to be able to sort those batteries into the right bins when they're recycled. So it's a very broad overview of the three elements. But I would say that normally, especially in the ZEV assurance measures, we would have done like a separate rulemaking for each one because they're their own rules among themselves. There's probably 8 different things that we did within those rules, but we found that it was so important to send the right signal that we don't want just golf carts. We want vehicles that can actually replace your gasoline vehicle and meet a consumer's kind of expectations in their mind of, I don't want to have to think about switching my mechanic. I don't want to think about that. I want to be able to do what I was doing, and I want to have that, kind of comfort going into this new realm. And we need policies like that all around, and we need creative people thinking about them in order to really go to zero emissions. So if there's any other questions, though, I'm happy to answer because there's a lot of different aspects of the rule I could go into. Oh, do you want to talk about myths? Should we talk about myths?
A couple myths.
Okay, I don't want to take up too much time. Okay, so we aren't banning gasoline vehicles. That's like probably a myth because every headline when we announced this was like, California's banning gasoline vehicles. We're not banning anything. We're setting the zero emission standard. And that's really important for any legal challenges that might come up in a state adoption of a rule. This is a performance-based standard, and it's written as a performance-based standard. And yes, we are saying that it's a zero emission standard, so there's not that many types of technologies that can meet that standard, but it is a zero emission standard. So that's probably that's the biggest one. The next one is, will the grid blow up because of this? In California, we've assessed this, and we have the electric vehicles are a teeny tiny portion of the total electrons that are going out through our grid. It was not a great look for us when our agency that controls the grid also sent out an alert, like the day after the board hearing, that everybody needed to stop charging their electric cars. So I think that there was a couple things that were going on there in California, but we have really there's a lot of work being done on the grid, and overall there's a lot of other agencies that are addressing that. But no, the electric car demand, there is room there. This rule will result in California with 12 million electric vehicles by 2035, and the grid as it stands today with no new power stations could take on double that amount. So that's where we stand in terms of the grid issue. I think we'll stop there, but I'm sure that there's going to be more throughout these questions and that come up maybe from any questions that we get from the folks that are attending.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for that really valuable myth busting. So looking at the big picture impacts of Advanced Clean Cars II, Erin, can you talk a little bit about why adoption of Advanced Clean Car II rules are so important for addressing climate change impacts across the West?
Yeah, I can definitely. When we look at greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change, transportation is the largest source of those greenhouse gas emissions nationally, and also for many states in the Intermountain West, including Colorado and Nevada, two of the states who have adopted the ACC standard, the ACC I standard. And not only is transportation the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions causing climate change, but it's also the source we are having the most difficulty in getting a handle on. In Colorado, for example, where the state has set ambitious greenhouse gas reductions to guide our efforts to tackle climate change, a recent report showed that the state is significantly off track to meet its 2025 emission goals, and transportation is by far the biggest culprit. The state is doing fine, doing okay, close to its goals for other sectors like the power sector, but the Colorado transportation sector is projected to be 40% higher than its 2025 goal. So states like Colorado that are making a good faith effort to address climate change, yet are not on track to reduce the transportation emissions fast enough, must look at all the tools they have at their disposal to wrangle down those transportation emissions, from better land use to more funding for public transit to the electrification of all forms of transportation. And of all these tools that decision makers have, ACC II is very likely one of the most significant policies they can adopt to cut greenhouse gas emissions. NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, and Western Resource Advocates are currently working on a modeling report to quantify how significant these emissions reductions would be. And we expect it to underscore the importance of quickly electrifying the light-duty vehicle fleet, as Advanced Clean Cars II would do. When you're trying to solve a difficult problem like climate change, you need to consider all the possible policies at your disposal. And I would argue that ACC II is one of the strongest policies that state leaders have. And thus it should be really important for leaders who are aiming to address the growing threat of climate change.
Absolutely. And in addition to helping mitigate climate change impacts and reduce greenhouse gases, this policy also has significant air quality and public health impacts. One, can you tell us more about how this policy and EV adoption can improve air quality and public health impacts, and specifically how the ACC II rule helps communities that are disproportionately impacted by air pollution and climate change?
Yes, adopting ACT I was great. Adopting ACT and Clean Cars II will help improve the lives and health of disproportionately impacted communities because it's targeting the source, which is emissions. And so we know, for example, in Colorado, we have a corridor that is Interstate 70 with Interstate 270 and Interstate 25, and that corridor forms a triangle. A traditionally, historically redlined community where there's a lot of freight, heavy trucking, and a lot of vehicle traffic that is caught on those corridors. And so by simply increasing to Clean Cars II and reducing emissions, we're having a direct impact on air quality. We know that air quality, that exposure to PM 2.5, NOx, nitrous oxide, nitrogen dioxide, and ozone is responsible and linked to increased rates of respiratory disease, increased rates of cardiac disease, increased risk of obesity, diabetes, and stroke. And recently, a study just came out of University of Colorado Boulder Integrated Physiology, in which they took data from the California Mother's Milk Research Project, and they looked at infants postnatal, so 0 to 6 months. And what they found as a result of that study that was released in the beginning of September was there's a clear link in how exposure to the air pollutants is causing the gut microbiome to not have improved, to have decreased growth. And so it's actually impacting 0 to 6 month olds and has impacts to how their gut biome systems develop. And so that is increasing their risk for diabetes, increasing their risk for Crohn's disease, and it's showing up with inflammation. And so we know then there are studies that show that at our adults older ages, cumulative exposure increases our risk of morbidity and mortality. And that risk is double, almost triple for some minority groups. There was a 16-year study that was put out by Health Effects Institute that collected that data and showed that that cumulative impact was increasing that risk of morbidity and mortality. So if we can reduce the exposures, then we can immediately see immediate results in improved health from both the infant side all the way through our developmental stages and ages into our senior years. So this is critically important for the health and lives of folks living in marginalized communities and disproportionately impacted communities.
Thank you for sharing those research findings, Juan. That's incredibly interesting to see how these emissions affect people throughout their lives. So given the moment that we are at with federal movement in terms of legislation, can you talk, Chris, a little bit about how new federal incentives complement and foster state efforts to electrify transportation through adoption of the Advanced Clean Cars II standard?
Sure. Yeah. So the new federal incentives put in place in the Inflation Reduction Act are going to be key to allowing more automakers to deliver greater volumes of more affordable EVs to middle-class consumers. The previous EV tax credits had a limit of $250,000 vehicles over which automakers lost access to incentives. This incentivized automakers to limit their EVs to the most expensive and most profitable models. And it really actually made it impossible for any popular mainstream model to maintain tax credit eligibility for more than a short period of time. This was a problem. With these new tax credits in place, though, we're expecting to see a number of lower cost, high volume mainstream EVs start to hit the market and take off in the 2025 to 2027 timeframe, right as the new Advanced Clean Cars II requirements start to ramp up, which should really help accelerate EV adoption and make compliance with zero emission vehicle requirements much, much easier.
So to dig into that a little bit more, can you tell me more about the economic impacts of the Advanced Clean Cars II rule? How will it benefit consumers in states that adopt the standard? And additionally, what economic development opportunities will it bring?
Sure. So one of the biggest benefits for consumers in states that adopt ACC II is going to be easier access to the EVs they want to buy. We know from past history that automakers tend to deliver greater volumes of popular EVs to states that have zero emission vehicle standards. And consumers in non-ZEV states often have a harder time buying the vehicles they want. This supply differential is likely to continue into the near future as automakers struggle to catch up with surging consumer demand. Furthermore, equity provisions in the Advanced Clean Cars II program will help support the ZEV market for those who have not traditionally benefited from clean technology in getting more ZEVs into the hands of middle and lower income consumers in states with these regulations. Furthermore, as Anna talked about early on, Advanced Clean Cars II also includes strong consumer protections for EVs that will ensure that good vehicles are going to be on the road for a long time. All of those ZEV assurance measures combined will help ensure that there are more quality used EVs on the road in states that adopt ACC II, which is really important because our analyses show But while new EVs save a lot of money for consumers, used EVs can save even more money for consumers who buy a used EV, because a lot of that upfront cost premium has been eliminated when you buy an EV on the secondary market. Furthermore, the Inflation Reduction Act also includes tax credits for buying those used EVs, which again will help the 70% of Americans who tend to buy their vehicles on the used market. I can stop there.
Great. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just talking about, on the economic side of things, when we're, I think great points from Chris about the way that ACC II will bring, more EVs to the market. And I think talking about the economic impacts of EVs generally, I think, in the time frame we're in, where, much of the public discourse is about inflation and helping reduce household expenses, the widespread adoption of EVs, as would be enabled by ACC II, is very exciting, because EV adoption, both at the household level and on the societal level, helps to cut back on fixed costs. Owning an EV saves consumers thousands of dollars a year on fueling and maintenance costs, as filling an EV up at home with electricity is roughly equivalent to $1 per gallon up to fuel, which is far less, obviously, than people with gasoline powered cars are paying right now. An EV has fewer moving parts, which leads to lower maintenance costs. So, owning an EV, whether new or used, is going to save the people who have those vehicles a lot of money over the course of a year in the life of the vehicle. And additionally, having more electric vehicles charging on the electricity system actually has been demonstrated both in real world studies and forward-looking ones to reduce the costs of electricity for all people paying electric bills, regardless of whether or not they own an EV. And that's because when EVs are charged at night or the early morning, when the electricity system is underutilized, they generate more revenue for the electric system than the cost they put on it. It's kind of I think, to put that a little more simply, everyone uses a shared electricity system, and EVs are putting more money into that shared system than they are taking from it, which helps to lower, average annual bills for electricity for all people who use that system. And that's even more true in places like Colorado, where utilities like Xcel Energy are encouraging customers with EVs to charge in the early evening, late evening and early morning. So in these ways, electric vehicles are helping to reduce critical household expenses, how much it costs to fuel your vehicle, how much you spend to maintain that vehicle, and how much you're spending on your monthly electricity bill.
Thank you, Aaron, for pointing out that really interesting connection between electric utility bills and electric vehicle adoption. So given all the benefits of this policy, what are the key factors that states need to consider as they contemplate adopting ACC II? And what are some of the barriers to adopting this rule, and how can state leaders overcome those hurdles to allow consumers to access the benefits of ACC II? Anna, would you like to take this one?
So in terms of the, clearing legislative barriers, that's probably what I really can't talk to, but I can talk to at least, there's certain rules that the Clean Air Act kind of has around states that can adopt. So first, you have to have had an attainment problem with the EPA rules around ozone. So Hawaii can never adopt our rules. So that's an unfortunate bit, but they're an island and they don't have air quality problems. So that's just an actual legal hurdle that has to be crossed for a state become a Section 177 state. I would say overall, we've seen the most successful states are the ones that they have legislative support, either specific legislative support to go ahead and do this kind of action. It's very difficult without that because ultimately you come across some really passionate advocates for other things that tend to fight against the rule when you are getting it adopted. We've found and I think that we've done a lot of work to build support in certain groups, like dealers were traditionally a really a really contentious group to work with, and we found a lot of opposition. But over time, and maybe even, you know, Chris can talk about this, over time, as more and more demand is growing, dealers are more into the idea of electric vehicles. So it really kind of depends on the state. It depends on the strongest lobbies within your state. And it depends on where the opposition can get really strong. So the help from the legislature, overall, we've seen that as being a really supportive way about going about even thinking, starting to comprehend this adoption of advanced clean cars too. It's not necessary, but it is helpful overall. But I think possibly Aaron could be better at answering this than I could, just because we're not supposed to advocate for states adopting a rule, other than we're supposed to create the rule knowing that other states may adopt someday.
Yeah, well, I mean, think you did a pretty good job. I mean, I think to me, I think the largest barrier is like kind of misconception of what the rule is. I think when you look at the combination of environmental, economic, and public health benefits that, you know, have been demonstrated to come from this rule, it really is a win for consumers and the environment. You know, this rule, as Anna said, it's not taking people's car away or making them buy more expensive vehicles. It's a requirement on the auto manufacturers to produce more affordable, reliable, durable, and sustainable vehicles. The technology standards that we talked about are the ZEV assurance methods, which is what Anna called it, which I'm sure is the right way to put it. Ensure that the vehicles are going to last longer. They're going to get people farther on a charge. They're going to be easier to be serviced. Some of the cool things, like the environmental justice credits, are going to aim to drive manufacturers to produce electric vehicles that are under $20,000 MSRP when purchased new. There's a lot of discussion. EVs are really expensive, but for reference, there are 3 gasoline powered cars on the market in 2020 model year 2023 that are under $20,000. So we're talking about driving manufacturers to produce cars that are truly affordable when purchased new. So I think, when you hear people who maybe don't like this rule talk about it, you're going to hear lots of misconceptions of those sorts. And I think education about what this rule is and what it does is the most important thing most important barrier to overcome.
Thanks, Aaron. That's really exciting to hear about the environmental justice credits and ensuring that this rule benefits everyone. How else can state officials ensure that efforts to electrify transportation through an ACC II rule benefit disproportionately impacted communities and low-income customers? Juan, would you like to answer this?
Yes. With the ACC II rule, leaders here in Colorado can start to impact our air quality from the get-go and have those incentives. We think about, by adopting these policies and getting, we know the policies take effect, and then there's that build up and ramp up period. But we know we can start to impact their air quality from day one, and we can reduce the prolonged cumulative exposure that leads to that increased morbidity and mortality. And so that is a benefit that we can see by adopting that. We also see for our communities, having many of our community members work as truck drivers or work in trucking industry and work in these other industries. And so they are behind the wheel of a vehicle that is polluting them as well. And then there's also the physiologic stress from driving a big rig, the loud noise, the vibration, which are all, again, part of those cumulative effects. So we can start to impact the health of the driver and the worker, and also the community by reducing the amount of contaminants in the air.
Thanks, Juan. Yes, it absolutely is a policy that starts working and delivering public health, economic and environmental benefits on day one, which is one of the reasons that it's such a wonderful policy that states can adopt to work on multiple problems. So, Anna, we've kind of touched around this a little bit, but can you speak specifically to the environmental justice credits and how they might work in a state such as New Mexico, Nevada, or Colorado?
Yeah. And I saw there's some questions also around this, and we can maybe get back to it. So there are three different types of values that a manufacturer can earn if they so choose. So it's a flexibility within the regulation, meaning that a manufacturer does not have to accumulate these values if they were, let's say, a luxury manufacturer and they might have a bunch of vehicles that are not fit for these kind of profiles. I need to say that because that might help answer the question about does the state have to have these equity programs? So I'll go with the one that doesn't require any program, and Aaron already talked about it, but there is a little bit of value that a manufacturer can earn for a vehicle, either a ZEV or a plug-in hybrid that is produced at a low price. So less than $20,000 for cars or less than $27,000 for trucks. And as I think Chris and Aaron both alluded to, that is the lowest of the low for new vehicle sale prices. It represents, the lowest 10% of that those segments. So that's one way for manufacturers to earn credit. And a little bit about that. This is, we were offering extra value because this is at a time when ZEVs and plug-in hybrids may not have reached cost parity with a gasoline counterpart. So we wanted to incentivize manufacturers to get there themselves. So that's one in that bucket. The next bucket is a connection into California's incentive programs. So that is if a manufacturer, this is about basically used ZEVs and plug-in hybrids. It's in the rule. It's called off lease. But basically, manufacturers have all these electric vehicles are usually leased at a higher rate. At least they were in the early years. That's coming down over time. But because of such high lease rate, they get a lot back, and so those manufacturers have more control over where those leased vehicles go next. And many of our incentive programs are partnered with dealerships, especially our low income incentive programs that are more targeted. They require a lot of training. So dealerships have to get trained through our incentive program side in order to actually be able to give out that money. So if a manufacturer actually delivers lots of vehicles to those participating dealerships, then they get a little bit of credit, and they get a little bit more credit if that vehicle actually ends up with a participant. So if New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, if you're thinking about an incentive program and you're thinking about a really targeted incentive program, like higher dollars to lower income individuals, which I know is a trend now for many states, if you think about a way for your dealerships to be in that with you, we've seen consumers really respond well to the incentive being more instantaneous at the dealership, and for those dealerships to actually be part of that partnership. So that's just one piece of advice if those states are thinking through their incentive programs. And then the third one has to do with this is bigger picture. Cap and trade creates some revenue for California to spend, and that's all directed in different ways by our legislature. And one of those ways is to develop community-based kind of electrification programs. And some of those offer community car share programs. And that means a community actually owns the car or a fleet of cars that are shared amongst a smaller area. So it's not like Uber. It's like if you went back to Zipcar, go 20 years back, Zipcar, but for a community. And so community organizations run these car share programs. So again, I'm not sure how much it's really taken on outside of California. We have about have that many. There's like less than 500 vehicles in these community car share programs in California, which is a really big place. But it's kind of funded through these programs. And I will say, we have a lot of people so this is manufacturers can offer a discount to those folks that run a community car share program, and that makes those dollars stretch farther for running those car share programs. So again, in states like New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, there are provisions that if you don't have your own ongoing programs, that communities can kind of like apply to you and say, we could run one. And then, the manufacturer would kind of get paired in with a community car share program and provide a discount. And there's provisions within there. And this is all to say that this is there's a lot of moving pieces here because it kind of takes this community car share program element. But we do have folks here at the board and myself that are so happy to partner with anybody in terms of doing a lot of sharing of what we know, how much money this might take to start these kind of programs, and offer ourselves as a resource. We've already talked to some states about these kinds of conversations. So just want to offer our support for if you really want to get in the weeds on those community car share programs. Okay, so those are the three buckets. I'll stop talking, but that's the environmental justice value piece.
Thank you, Anna, for breaking that down. Definitely a lot of moving parts, so glad to have you on to explain. So next we're going to take an audience question, which is, what advice do you have for states lacking legislative and public support for ACC II standards? What are other state level policy and regulatory approaches have been successful to build support, gain traction and buy-in, and start to show the benefits of emission standards? And whoever wants to jump in, feel free.
I can talk a little bit. Sometimes we have had states that have not adopted the zero emission vehicle regulation. And I'm not saying not to do that, but there are states that are Section 177 states that are all about, they need the clean air benefits from our other program, which is called the low emission vehicle program. It's the one about gasoline vehicles. And what we found is some of those states that may not have had the political support for the more aggressive zero emission vehicle regulation, they have been able to get support around clean air. Clean air is a topic that a lot of people can get around, especially if you have issues attaining ozone targets. We've all talked about it. Juan has done the best job of talking about it, but basically every time that you clean up your dirtiest sectors, which for many of us, that's light duty vehicles, anytime that you clean up a bunch of those vehicles, the benefits are statewide, especially if you're like California, you have valleys where your air pollution gets stuck. So it's even if you can't adopt the zero emission vehicle regulation, we have seen other states successfully adopt our other parts of our regulations like greenhouse gas or LEV and provide huge benefits. And then we've seen them finally be able to gain enough support to also adopt ZEV. So that's not to say I don't want you to adopt ZEV, but that's one way of thinking about it, is building more support around clean air, which is actually one of the biggest drivers of what we do. It was our original driver of what we do. And it's a easier topic to sell sometimes than electrification or zero emission.
Thank you for that. Would anyone like to add on to Anna's answer?
I think that was a great answer. And I think that there's, the framing around clean air, I think, is a really strong way to approach this around air quality. And we've seen that be a more successful narrative in some of the states that we work in that, may not be as excited about reaching climate goals or electrification, but they can also electrification can also be sold in the context of clean air. And, that may not be a standard for vehicles, but it can be, other things like, support for electric trucks, or support for, utility investment in EV infrastructure or EV infrastructure at large. That's something I think that in other states we've seen, be successful, is like to kind of sell the non-climate benefits of electrification, because those things are unfortunately not as politicized. So there's definitely a lot of things that can be done in the context of air quality and, embracing new technology and whatever, things like that.
Thanks, y'all. So we have another question from the audience, and this one is state specific. So the question is, how long can Colorado, and by extension other states, wait to decide whether or not to adopt ACC II? When does the window for deciding close?
There is no window, so that's exciting. What is mandated in the Clean Air Act is a 2-year lead time, and I'm going to go back to a regulatory speak and CAR speak of 2 model years. That's how that's been interpreted over and over again in law and precedent. So it's 2 model years. And so it doesn't turn on instantaneously. So the states that are most, that have been with us the longest, that have a lot of legislative authority to go ahead and adopt our rules, some of them are going ahead and going to follow very quickly behind in order to get 2026 model year. And so that's already happening. Then anybody else who chooses to kind of want to do this path, let's say that a state were to adopt, go through their rulemaking process and be done by 2023, that would mean that they can start the requirements in 2027. And that's again, because of how model years work, which is annoying, but the truth. So, but there's no limit or deadline by which you have to adopt. Another thing that kind of goes on the last question, but maybe goes along with this too, is there's no requirement to adopt the entire program. So you can't, you can maybe say out to 2020, 2030, let's say, and that, because that 100% number is maybe not really what might work in your state. There might be other ways to follow closely along with California for a bit of the time, as we know that there's an ongoing effort for federal rulemakings on, for light duty vehicles, and just kind of see how those shape out. So just to say there's a couple of different options, and there's actually more freedom within that space, but no matter what, you basically have a lead time thing that kicks in, and you can't start until a bit after you've actually done all the work of the rulemaking.
Great, I appreciate the breakdown of CAR talk and regulatory talk. That's really helpful. Okay, so I have one last question for all our panelists today, since we're starting to run a little short on time. Is there anything that you would like to add to this discussion, or issues that you would like to raise that we have not talked about today?
I guess I would add for the economic impacts to DIC, disproportionately impacted communities. In addition to the health benefits, we believe some of the incentives can also work for many of our community members who work as mechanics. And so we look at that transition from earlier, we said, well, I don't want to give up my auto mechanic that's working on my car, right? So now we can take our community and our community members and plug them into occupations where they're learning and getting that incentive and learning how to work on EV vehicles, knowing that that's going forward. And so that not only benefits us and those disproportionately impacted communities economically that way by having job security and going into these innovative areas, as well as the additional benefit of improved air quality.
Absolutely, thank you for that point, Juan. Chris, Anna, Aaron, anything else that you would like to add to the conversation?
I've got one, just kind of reiterating on some other things I've already said, but really in our surveys, 2 of the biggest barriers to consumer adoption of EVs are really infrastructure and upfront costs. And recent federal legislation between the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act really attack these 2 barriers head on, and really will help to lower those barriers significantly. And as those barriers come down, states are really going to run into this third challenge, which is getting enough vehicles built to meet the consumer demand. And ACC II is really a very useful and targeted tool that can be used by states to really help address this final challenge and really ensure that automakers build and deliver those vehicles that we know consumers want, we know that will benefit consumers. And so, yeah.
Anna or Aaron, anything that either of you would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I just am just saying, on a positive note, and a call to action, I think in the last year or two, we've seen tremendous progress in our efforts to decarbonize transportation at the federal, state, utility, private sector levels. And I think it's pretty inspiring and important to take a moment to be grateful and think how far we've come just in the last 2 years. But also, we can't get content patting ourselves on the back. The science is still pretty grim. We keep getting reports that we're not on track to meet our emission targets. And what that means is we need to make big emission cuts, and we need to do it quickly. But with the passage, like Chris was saying, with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, Inflation Reduction Act, and of course the approval of ACC II, we've opened up a new world of opportunity where we have real effective tools to make those serious cuts that we need. But right now, I think we're in a point where it's up to us at the state level to ensure that those gains are realized by properly utilizing federal resources, adopting the ACC II rule, and rules like it that require manufacturers to produce more electric vehicles and at the rate that's necessary to address the climate crisis. And I feel like we're kind of in the space where we're turning the tide, but we need to continue to act with the urgency that's required by the moment to make sure we're addressing the climate change and air quality crises that are currently facing us.
Yeah, thank you so much for kind of reminding us of the big picture and why this policy is so important. Thank you to all of our panelists so much for sharing your incredibly valuable expertise with us. It looks like we are running out of time, so sorry if I didn't get to anyone's question from the audience in the chat, but I will go ahead and hand it back over to Jen and Nava.
Thanks, Deb, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. Such a great conversation, discussion today. I want to thank everyone for attending. Watch out for this webinar recording in your email in the next couple of days here. It will also be posted on our website under the webinar section. And just one final plug, if you are interested in supporting WRA's transportation electrification work or other on-the-ground climate solutions, please visit us at westernresourceadvocates.org/donate. I hope to see you again at a future webinar. Have a great day.